I'm Jake Levitin, Program Coordinator of the Institute for Humanities Research here at Arizona State University, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's event honoring Joseph Pugliese's Biopolitics of the More Than Human, Forensic Ecologies of Violence, winner of the 2022 IHR Book Award. Before introducing Nicole Anderson, who will give an opening statement, I wanted to let you know the rundown of today's event. Following Professor Anderson's remarks, you'll hear from the advisory board and Professor Pugliese himself. Then we'll have a panel discussion and open things up for questions. Place yours in the Q&A throughout, and I'll read them aloud for our speakers to answer. Now, I'm pleased to recognize this year's IHR Book Award finalists. Sarah Wasserman is the author of The Death of Things, Ephemera in the American Novel. Published by the University of Minnesota Press, the book comprises a vital engagement with constellations of transients across the field of 20th century American literature, shedding new light on the forms of loss that take shape in the work of authors ranging from Ralph Ellison to Thomas Pynchon, Marilyn Robinson to Michael Chabon, and beyond. Anahid Nersessian is the author of The Calamity Forum on Poetry and Social Life, published by the University of Chicago Press. Nersessian's timely and critical work promises to be of considerable purchase for years to come in its radical combinatory framework that produces a conceptually rich and socially attuned analysis of romantic poetics with broad salience for grappling with the present day. Finally, Thomas Stubblefield's Drone Art, The Everywhere War as Medium, published by the University of California Press, acts as a vital intervention in art history and visual culture studies, rooted in the critique of drone technologies and extrajudicial forms of state violence. And now I'm thrilled to introduce Nicole Anderson, Director of the IHR, Professor of English at ASU, and Editor-in-Chief of Derrida Today. Welcome, Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Again, welcome to the IHR Book Award event. The Book Award was established in 2008. Each year, the IHR solicits from publishers nationwide books they nominate for the award. We generally secure around 20 books, which the IHR Advisory Board read and review. It's quite a task. And of the 20 books this year that we received, there were 4 shortlisted for the prize. As Jacob has announced, of those 4 shortlisted, the winner was Professor Joseph Pugliese for his book, Biopolitics of the More Than Human, by Duke University Press. And I'm delighted that the Senior Executive Editor of Duke University Press, Ken Wissaker, and Executive Editor, Courtney Berger, are here with us on Zoom today. And a big congratulations again to the runner-ups, Sarah Wasserman, Anahid Nersessian, and Thomas Stubblefield. But before introducing Joseph and the panel members, Professor Susan Stryker, Randall Abdelphata, and Andrew Mara, I want to hand it over to Professor Ron Berlio, the Associate Director of the IHR, and Associate Professor Alana Luna, who on behalf of the IHR Advisory Board will make statements as to why the board voted Pugliese's book the winner of the 2022 award. Over to you, Ron and Alana.
Great, thank you very much, Nicole. And as Nicole is saying, it's both a pleasure and a difficulty in choosing a book for the annual award. We get quite a few books coming in, and it gives us a sense of the field today and its interests and themes. Often we're looking for a book that is approachable, readable by a variety of people, one that can connect, and that in itself is difficult in the field. And then one that can connect to multiple interests in the humanities. So rather than only a depth in scholarship in a singular field or a singular subfield within a field, one that can appeal to a variety of humanities interests. And yet, one that is smart within the fields it engages in, that is rigorously studied in the conversations within those fields. And ideally something that is resonant with contemporary concerns as a way in for readers and as a display for public-facing humanities. So Biopolitics of the More Than Human, is readable and appealing to multiple audiences. And for example, here at ASU, the book aligns with many groups and interests, including, of course, sustainability, environmental humanities, our Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, Indigenous Knowledge Faculty, Applied Theory Initiative here at the IHR, the Center for Philosophical Technologies, our Animal Studies group, Post-Colonialism group, and really so much more. So while informed by theory, and I must say it's quite accurate and adept in its use both of Foucault, its understanding of and critique of property rights, and hat tip to our ASU's Karen Bradshaw, who works on animal and property rights, and also the use of forensics in a forensic ecology. The book has all of those. One can read it without fully engaging with these theoretical lenses and still walk away with quite a bit. It's a very timely book, particularly given the number of wars taking place today and the war in the Ukraine. And it's timely in the US and global context of issues of social justice. The concept of forensic ecologies provokes the readers into thinking about crimes against the non-human. Where is the court and who is the judge for such violations? Humans, what have we done? And to give you just a sense of the style of the book. In this book, I attempt to listen to the voices of the rubble in Gaza, a lemon tree in occupied East Jerusalem, the ants of Guantanamo, in the wake of a drone missile strike, the leaves and rocks that fuse with human and animal flesh in a field in Yemen. In attending to these more than human voices and testimonies, my concern is to account for the other victims of militarized violence and occupation that traditional forensic approaches fail to acknowledge, and yet unquestionably constitute the violated entities of a forensic ecology. So both in its look at the larger scope of ideas and its specificity and materiality of place. Writing is a labor for the future with unknown outcomes, and indeed, we see the labor and the love and the passion in this book. What will be the fate of these words as one writes them? Who will read them? Who will apply them? I'm happy to say that this book has found an audience in a home and now an award. Thank you, Joseph Pugliese, for your labors of love. And I'll turn it over now to Alana Lund.
Thank you. So I am going to jump in and continue where Ron left off. The committee this year, as every year, but especially this year, the work was really quite exciting. As we've seen, there were many excellent books that touched on several of the topics that Joseph Pugliese does in what is our selection for this year's award, which is this, Biopolitics of the More Than Human. This book stood out for the reason that Dr. Broglio has mentioned, and in my mind is exceptional for how it brings together both urgency and accessibility to those of us studying humanities. In his own words, the book, and I quote, delineates acts of violence produced by the forces of armed conflict and or occupation, forces that are tautologically and by definition violent, and discusses the forensic ecologies left in the wake of these acts of violence. And that's from early on in the book. He's telling us what he's doing. And one key example, when discussing a very particular war-ravaged landscape, he writes, standing their ground in the afforested space of a now effaced village, the trees continue to signify as forensic traces of an otherwise erased Palestinian history. They are, as such, archiphenomena of memory. They are at once vegetal forms of life that are inscribed in nature and cultural repositories of a relational history. The trees, in other words, embody what I would term a phytosemiotics of biocultural history, and that's from page 113. In this book, the concept of the more than human itself is beautifully elucidated, and while the scope of the project is absolutely ambitious, Pugliese uses concrete examples, textual analysis, and a deep historical and geopolitical understanding to make an ethical argument that is undeniable. His approach allows for a critique that recognizes not only the differential impact of war, violence, surveillance, and occupation on differently gendered humans and social groups, but also foregrounds an advocacy for all that warrants consideration, preservation, protection, and restitution. It's not a light read, but it is accessible for the very reason of addressing colonial settler regimes that are pervasively familiar in international media. What is most striking to me is that the examples that he chooses and the very clear writing, while not emotional in and of themselves, evoke deep compassion for the more than human stakeholders in landscapes wrought with violence. I especially appreciated the study as it expands the idea of humanities to a consideration that pushes past the anthropocentric and the Eurocentric, asking us to interrogate not just who and what can be legally killed or destroyed, but how those hierarchies shape our collective possibility for a future on this planet. In sum, we chose this book not only because of what it does, but because of how others can use Pugliese's research methods and approaches to disentangle multifactorial problems, identify and understand the multiple stakeholders, and propose ethical action in any of the myriad conditions of colonialism, extractivism, and state violence that we currently know and study. So with that, I am very happy to congratulate Joseph on this book, and I will turn it back over to the group.
Thank you, Ron and Alana. And now, without further ado, let me introduce you to Joseph Pugliese, who in a moment will give a around 30-minute presentation on his book before we enter the panel discussion. I've known Joseph for many, many years, and for this reason, I didn't partake of the voting on as part of the IHR Advisory Board. As we all know, biographies don't tell the whole story about a scholar and their passions or what motivates them. It's one of the questions I'll ask during the panel discussion. But what is admirable about his work is his passion and relentless and tireless activism around social justice issues. He constantly puts himself, and I've seen this firsthand, he constantly puts himself on the line to stand up for what he believes is ethically right and for the human rights of those marginalized peoples and groups, as well as animals and ecology. He doesn't just write about this, he walks the talk. This is actually reflected in his key research areas. To quote Joseph, social justice understood in the most expansive sense so that it includes the more than human world is the superordinate term that encompasses the entirety of my research. Under this meta-rubric, my key fields of research are colonialism and decoloniality, state violence, war and carcerality, more than human ecologies, race, whiteness and ethnicity, law, culture and humanities, visual culture, and migration and diaspora. Joseph has a long list of publications, too many to go through now. Suffice to say that many of his books have been nominated for awards. For example, his book, Biometrics, Bodies, Technologies, Biopolitics by Routledge, was shortlisted for the International Surveillance Studies Book Prize in 2010. His book, State Violence and the Execution of Law, Biopolitical Caesura of Torture, Black Sites, Drones, again by Routledge, was nominated for the UK's Hart Socio-Legal Book Prize in 2013, the US's Law and Society Association Herbert Jacob Prize in 2013, and it was also awarded the Macquarie University Faculty of Arts Research Excellence Award in 2013, and it received high commendation in the Macquarie University Research Excellence Awards in 2014 and in 2015. On top of this, with his colleague, Professor Subendrini Pereira, he was a chief investigator on the ARC-funded transnational project, and ARC is equivalent to NEH. So the project was Deathscapes on racialized state violence in settler societies. Descapes was shortlisted for the Australian Council of the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences Distinctive Work Prize in 2019. Welcome, Joseph. Congratulations on your book award, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for your really warm introduction. And thank you, Ron Broglio and Iluna, for your incredibly generous comments on the book. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the unceded sovereignty of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Wasserman clan of the Darug Nation, on whose lands the book was written. And this sort of acknowledgement is never rhetorical or formulaic for me. It's a deeply felt acknowledgement, precisely because these cultures, these Indigenous cultures upon whose lands I stand, their knowledges, their customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the lands and the more than human relations since time immemorial. And in a very real sense, they've made the book possible, and they've informed the sort of relational ethical framework that underpins the entirety of the book. So thank you, Nicole. Nicole, would you like me to start talking about the book? And
yeah, if you want to just go straight into talking about your book,
sure,
that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess a good place to start is where I actually start in the book, where I begin to survey, almost in a cinematic way, the landscape in occupied Palestine after a missile strike from the Israeli Defense Forces in the course of the military campaign called Operation Protective Edge in July 2014. And looking at that landscape, I began to see, and Ron quoted some of the words from the writing on that landscape. I saw a fig tree that had been blasted and was covered in cement dust. I saw a father and uncle who had literally been disemboweled and because of the missile strike. The landscape that was created, and compelled to sort of look at that landscape, I thought there's a relationality here that's not taken into account by international law of armed conflict. There's an ethical violation here that is not taken into account by law of what's considered to be justiciable, something that we can produce justice for. And simultaneously, while Operation Protective Edge was unfolding, I was actually following it on Twitter, and I had citizen journalists from Palestine post what was unfolding in the context of the July 2014 war. And these posts were coming in saying, my beehive has been bulldozed. My sheep have been riddled with bullets. Our waters are now polluted from the spent ordnance of the missile strikes. And I began to sort of think about everything that was not being reported by the media in terms of the other victims of war. Simultaneously, what I did was I went to a number of testimonies, and two really important testimonies, in order to corroborate and amplify the sort of citizen journalist postings that I was reading as they were coming in on the Twitter feed. I went to two books in particular that were published soon after the war, and they were published by the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. One was Our Harsh Logic, and the other was This Is How We Fought. And what B'Tselem did was it staged a series of interviews with, if you like, dissenters, Israeli Defense Force dissenters, who wanted to put on record what actually happened in the course of Protective Edge. And that was very important for me, so as to, if you like, have two sides of the argument speaking exactly the same sort of thing, speaking to exactly the same sort of topic. And that was what had been perpetrated during the course of that. And when I read the Israeli Defense Forces testimonies in This Is How We Fought and in Our Harsh Logic, they corroborated what the Palestinian citizen journalists were saying, and they amplified it, and they said, well, actually, there were no rules of engagement when we went in. And rules of engagement really are, if you like, the checks and guidelines that govern a military operation. So it's not pandemonium. So there isn't, if you like, a violation of international law, for example, in terms of proportionality, etc., when you're bombing or conducting a military campaign. So a number of the Israeli Defense Forces soldiers said there were no rules of engagement, which meant that they could do what they wanted. And then they evidenced this by saying, well, yes, we went into the landscape and we actually plowed down chicken coops with live chickens in there. We went into a forest, an orchard actually, and we riddled the forest with bullets so that it turned into vegetable pulp. We destroyed beehives. And so the catalogue went on, and I thought, well, I've been writing on biopolitics. The previous book that I did prior to this was the book on state violence and the execution of law, where I looked at post 9/11 landscapes of conflict, war and conflict. But coming out of that book and looking at what had been documented in the context of Operation Protective Edge, I thought that there was an incredible gap and that I'd really missed something in the previous book. And this really impelled me to begin to develop a framework to begin to account for these more than human victims and their complex relationality to their human subjects. So one of the things that I absolutely refuse to do in this book, and if you've read the book, you know I stage trenchant critiques of people, of cultural critics who demand a sort of isolationism on the part of human subjects and say, well, we should just leave nature alone. We should have nothing to do with them. We should, create these protective reserves, step out. And for me, that produces this, by default, anthropocentric supremacy, because again, it's humans dictating what nature should do, what the more than human should occupy, and this rupture, if you like, between the sort of ethical and affective relationships that for me are very pivotal in how we comport ourselves in this world. So what I did was I went back to the biopolitical frame that I'd been using in my state violence book, and I thought this is actually inadequate because, again, it's anthropocentrically informed. It can only account for state governance of human populations in terms of, and in a nutshell, biopolitics basically instantiates regimes of governance or governmentality that do two things. One, they enable selective racialized populations to flourish, to reproduce. And on the other hand, they target racially other populations to the point that they can be killed with impunity, or, as Foucault would say, merely left to die. So that's the basic lens of Foucauldian biopolitics. And I thought, well, actually, it's inadequate to take into account what I'm witnessing as a secondary witness, not as a primary witness, as these reports and testimonies come in. And not just in the context of occupied Palestine, but in the context of the drone killing fields of Yemen, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and also in the context of Guantanamo and the carceral regime there. So what I did was I thought, well, let me take the liberty then of fracturing this Foucauldian anthropocentric lens, of opening it up so it begins to encompass what it cannot at the moment address. And that was, I thought, what I'll do is sort of provocatively develop a new vocabulary, so to speak, in order to name and identify what Foucauldian anthropocentric biopolitics doesn't. So I thought one way of doing this is to develop these names. So I developed sort of the terminology of phytopolitics because I thought vegetal life is being targeted here, trees, plants, flowers. And phytopolitics began to examine the way in which, for example, trees and vegetable life are also victims of war. And I look at the way in which they are destroyed either by missile strikes or by machine gunning them, as the IDF did in the Palestinian orchards, or where herbicide is purposefully applied, as the IDF do along the Palestinian-Israeli borders. And what they do is, in a sense, weaponize the landscape by applying herbicide and killing fields of wheat, killing trees, killing vegetable life, so they can get clearer surveillance of the landscape, so to speak, for military purposes. And so I thought there's a specific form of biopolitics here that, you know, I'm calling phytopolitics from the Greek, which means trees, vegetable life, phyto. And I thought that begins to address and to bring into critical focus something that has not been focused on in traditional anthropocentric biopolitics. And as a sort of cascade effect, I then began to look at water, you know, what I call aquapolitics within these biopolitical regimes. Peat-on politics, the effect of soil, the effect of war and occupation and military conflict on soil, the impacting of soil, the bombing of soil so that microbial life is destroyed, so its fertility is destroyed. And then the seeping of the military spent ordnance into the soil so that there's a continuing unfolding of toxicity, of poisons that have lateral effects across the soil as they seep into the water tables, as they poison the plants. The other aspect I looked at was zoopolitics, where animals were also caught in the crosshairs of war. Sheep, bees, ants, as I discussed in Guantanamo, goats, as I discussed in the military strikes in Yemen. And so by fracturing the anthropocentric biopolitical lens, I wanted to bring into focus through this naming the specificity of other entities, of more than human entities, that really, for me, are worthy of ethical consideration and, importantly, require justiciability. They require the application of justice because they are also targets and victims of war. I didn't leave it at that. What concerned me was how all of this fitted, if you like, within a system of relationality. And that's where Indigenous, you know, what I call cosmo-epistemologies came into their own, and I drew heavily and heavily indebted to both Native American and Aboriginal Australian cosmo-epistemologies. And I call them cosmo-epistemologies for two reasons. One, they are not just epistemological systems that give us knowledge about things. I think what's really important about Indigenous cosmo-epistemologies is that they create a cosmology within these knowledge systems so that there's a sense of how it is all connected, how the parts are connected in holistic ways. And more importantly, on top of that, embedded within these Indigenous frames, both in Native American and Aboriginal Indigenous frames, is a deep sense of ethical relationality. So once I developed that sort of more than human biopolitical framework, my goal really was to begin to account for, one, the ethical relations that bind different subjects within those frames. And, you know, if you've read the book, I absolutely refuse to talk about the more than human as objects. And I use the term entities in order to bring into focus their beingness, if you like, their ontology in the world, and to rupture that typically Eurocentric subject-object hierarchy, which biopolitically, I argue in the book, gives license for whatever it is that's dispatched to the lower rung of object. That gives license really to torture and to kill with impunity, whether it be a human subject or a more than human subject. And really, that's where something like Guantanamo in the book comes into its own. because what I saw operating there was precisely the transmutation, if you like, of the human subjects, the detainees, into non-human objects that could be tortured and killed with utter impunity and above and beyond any sort of legal accountability. So the impetus really was then to begin to situate all of these various entities within their relational ethical frameworks and to argue for a system of justiciability, a legal system of justiciability that in non-Western, that is accounted for in non-Western legal frames, Native American and Indigenous, where there are deep frameworks of law in relation to the more than human, but is completely absent largely from Western legal frames, and more importantly, within frameworks of international law. And I draw upon international law because what governs regimes of armed conflict and war is international law of war and international law of the environment. And none of the extant international laws of law and the environment or law and armed conflict take into consideration the more than human victims of war and armed occupation as worthy of legal consideration unto themselves and not just as adjuncts to human frames. So I really, and for me, it was in a sense not surprising that international law fails to do this, precisely because if you trace the origins of international law, it's deeply embedded within the colonial order that emerged in the 17th century in particular, and was driven by imperial Western interests. They reproduced themselves across all forms of international law, and specifically, for my, in terms of my interest, in the context of international laws of war and international laws of war and the environment. And so I saw that lingering effect of the anthropocentrism of international law play itself out in these contexts of conflict and war, and their failure then, their systemic failure. So in a way, what I wanted to do then, I thought, well, if they're not taking into account, how can I develop a framework that speaks to the illegality of what is happening here in these contexts? And I thought, well, I'm going to misappropriate, if you like, forensics and apply it over these fields, because forensics really is about testimony and it's about evidence. And more importantly for me, it's about more than human entities offering testimony, even though traditional forensics disavows what I call the animistic qualities of more than human entities, like forensic will draw on glass, fibers of clothing, analyze them and say, well, here they are speaking about how a person was murdered, for example. And, the role of the forensic scientists in the court of law is to, as they say, bring voice to what they term the forensic object, an item of clothing that will disclose the identity of the victim or the identity of the murder. And they talk about bringing those more than human objects, as they call them, to voice. So I thought, let me misappropriate forensics and transpose it to these fields, because built in the concept of forensics is this concept of ethical and legal responsibility to the entity that has been violated. Simultaneously, as you would know if you've read the book, I was also very reflexive about the shortcomings of forensics and how in itself it's also a fraught field, because like much that we deal with in the West, it's heavily imbricated within colonial history. So I've been writing in forensics for a number of decades. And so what I wanted to mark was, again, the colonial genealogy that shapes so much of forensics. For example, the first forensic practice was developed and implemented by the British imperialists in India in the 1850s, where the inked fingerprint was developed by the colonial governments there in order to identify Indian insurgents who were contesting British colonial rule. And they did that specifically because for the white Raj, all Indians looked alike and they could not distinguish them. So, you know, again, an embedded coloniality, an embedded imperialism, an embedded irraciality right at the roots of forensics. So I was very reflexive of that. And I was also reflexive of the way in which in the multiple histories of forensics that I read, never once was the role of Indigenous forensics acknowledged. And I say Indigenous forensics because both in the US and in Australia, police departments over the centuries deployed Indigenous trackers to find murderers, to find missing persons in the bush, precisely because of their absolute attunement to the landscape and their ability to read more than human traces and the sorts of testimonies that more than human entities were giving about someone who was missing. None of that is recorded in traditional forensic history. So I wanted to mark that too. Lastly, when I applied the forensic frame, I was very reflexive of the way in which forensics deploys a very, if you like, scientific analytical frame that disavows any affective engagement with the entity that's being discussed. So, you know, questions of affect are seen to be play a contaminating role in forensics, and that sort of object-subject hierarchy and objectification of the more than human forensic entity comes into play all over again. So again, I wanted to rupture that because the last thing I wanted to do was to create a distanced and objectifying lens on these more than human entities that were speaking various sorts of testimonies to what had been perpetrated to them. And so the role of affect is particularly important for me as a way of rupturing that process of Western objectification of the more than human, and of deploying thus a sense of ethical boundedness to the other, whoever they are, within that relational ethical frame. And, you know, for me, the notion that you can analyze, that you can write, that you can think in a purely pristine way that's uncontaminated by affect and in emotion is an absolute nonsense. I mean, it's not a possibility. Every thinking process that we do is bodily. It's comported by our bodily frames, our locus in the world, and the way in which we can't separate as much as we would wish to our emotional effects. It's a form of emotional intelligence that illuminates analytical frames. So I drew on questions of emotional intelligence to speak to what would otherwise be repressed, effaced, and violated, and that is questions of emotional boundedness with the other, whoever the other is. So the book then began to traverse different landscapes by deploying this more than human biopolitical lens and by trying to call into account the various states and their regimes of violence, their regimes of occupation and their regimes of war, and to bring into focus that the other and more than human subjects that were caught within these were worthy of ethical consideration and were justiciable. They required processes of justice and law to call into account the perpetrators of the crimes that had been perpetrated against them. I think I'll stop there, Nicole.
Okay. Jacob, would you be able to put me back on video, please? Thank you. Thank you. Joseph, thank you so much. That was really enlightening and comprehensive about, well, considering it was only a 30-minute talk, you covered quite a lot of ground, so thank you. What I'm going to do is we're going to go straight into the panel, and the panel today is an informal discussion around some of the key issues that around Joseph's book, but also about what he's talked about today. And I'm really delighted to introduce as part of the panel first Susan Stryker, who is Emeritus Professor of Gender and Women's Studies. And since retiring from University of Arizona, she has been Presidential Fellow and Visiting Professor of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. Barbara Lee, Distinguished Chair in Women's Leadership, Mills College, and Martin Sutton Weeks, External Faculty Fellow at Stanford University Humanities Institute, and that's from 2022 to 2023. She continues to serve as Executive Editor of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, and as co-editor of the Duke University Press book series, Asterix, Gender, Trans, and All That Comes After, which is such a great title. She is the author of Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution, 2008-2017, co-editor of the 2-volume Transgender Studies Reader, 2006-2013, and the Transgender Studies Reader Remix, 2022, as well as co-director of the Emmy-winning documentary film Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, 2005, which if you haven't seen it, you've got to see it, it's fantastic. She is currently working to complete her book manuscript, Changing Gender, and developing a variety of film, television projects. And I'm so pleased that Susan has agreed to be on the panel today. And I'm really looking forward to your thoughts, Susan. We then have Dr. Randall Abdelphata, is a future fellow in the Department of Sociology at Macquarie University in Sydney. She researches Islamophobia, Arab Muslim social movements, and the generational impact of the war on terror on Muslim and non-Muslim youth. She is a prominent Australian Palestinian advocate and a multi-award winning author of 16 books for children and young adults, published in over 20 countries. Her most recent academic books are the critically acclaimed Coming of Age in the War on Terror and Islamophobia and Everyday Multiculturalism. And Randa is also a columnist for The New Arab. Thank you again for being here. And finally, but not least, we have Andrew Mara, who is part of the IHR Advisory Board, who voted Pugliesi's book this year's winner. He is an associate professor in technical writing and communication and former faculty head of interdisciplinary humanities and communication in the College of Integrative Arts and Humanities at ASU. His research interests include digital and new media rhetoric, institutional innovation, posthumanism, technical writing, and user experience. Andrew formerly worked for Sandia National Laboratories as a communication specialist and continues to work with local and regional nonprofits to create more robust and responsive user ecologies. He has recently published the book UX, is that how I say it? UX on the Go, a flexible guide to user experience design, edited a special issue of Technical Communication Quarterly on posthumanism, and has published over 30 journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings on writing innovation and communities of practice. Andrew has also created an interactive arts app, built a digital dissertation studio, and is currently building out user experience display programs at ASU. Now, I've asked, thank you, Andrew, for agreeing to be on the panel. I've asked Susan, Randa, and Andrew to be on this panel, not only because of the intersections of their work with Joseph's, but because, like Joseph, in one way or another, their work promotes and advocates for social good and social justice. Welcome all of you, and thank you very much for agreeing to be here. Now, there are a number of issues that I want to raise with the panel about Joseph's book, and I will be keen to hear how you all think the key topics might touch on your respective works. But before I direct questions to the panel, which I'll do in a moment, I'd like to first ask Joseph, what motivated you, Joseph, to actually write the book? I mean, I know you touched on it somewhat in your talk, but if you could just reiterate some of that and extend on that, that'd be great.
Oh, thank you, Nicole. Well, really, the global crisis that's unfolding. and I say that sort of I say that seriously. I'm absolutely preoccupied by the enormity of the impact of global climate change and the way we're at risk of destroying the planet effectively. And it seems to me that, you know, the current world order, as it's addressed and governed by, you know, those frameworks of international law that I critiqued, are inadequate to preserving planet and saving life in all of its heterogeneity. That's the larger context. And you know, I come back to that in the afterward and situate all of the concerns that I've raised in the book within the contemporary global ecological crisis that's unfolding. And I think what really drove me was the way in which, except for a few scholars that of course name and acknowledge in the book, the military-industrial complex flies under the radar whenever we're talking about global climate change and carbon emissions, etc. And yet, as I evidence in the book, the US is the largest emitter of carbon because of its military processes and campaigns, because of its uses of so many of the globe's resources. And so something as huge as the US military thus flies under the radar and gets effaced within this global climate crisis. So the impetus then was to recenter the military-industrial complex in all of its sort of manifestations, whether it be the Israeli Defense Forces or the US military, the two that I examine in the context of the book, how they are working to bring and to amplify this larger ecological crisis. And thus, the book's impetus was recentering them so that we see the extraordinary, powerful and influential role that they are playing, but also contesting it and offering via those Indigenous cosmologies that I speak to, different ways of understanding how we can live in the world and the sort of ethics of relations and considerability that they call for in order that we can continue to live and to preserve the planet in all of its extraordinary beauty.
Thank you, Joseph. The book draws on a number of philosophical and critical theories to analyse the key topics in the book, key topics you've just touched on. And yet, despite this, the book approaches those topics with a deep level of affect, and you talked about that in your talk. Susan, Randa, and Andrew, what do you think is the importance of this approach? What do you think this might achieve? And is there anything about the book that resonates with your own works? Susan, can maybe I start with you first?
Sure. So first of all, I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Stanford University, which is on the traditional and unceded lands of the Muwekma and the Ramaytush band of the Ohlone people. And after that acknowledgement, I just want to say thank you, Nicole, for inviting me to be on this panel. It's great to see you. It's really great to see Joseph, to meet my other co-panelists. And I say that because both of your work, I think, has been really influential in my own. It's like one of the highlights of my own academic career is the time that I've spent at Macquarie University in Sydney, where I've been colleagues with both of you at different times, and the way that the thinking that came out of the Department of Critical and Cultural Studies, where we developed the concept of a somatechnics, the idea of like how do you erase that boundary between embodiment and the means of becoming embodied, a technics that points beyond the world of objects as we normally think about them, to think about the interrelationality of all things, through particular ways of being interconnected. And I'll just say, Joseph, though, when we co-edited the special issue on somatechnics of race and whiteness for social semiotics, it's like, for me, that was a moment of intellectual crystallization. So I'm just so pleased to be able to honor the work that you've done that, you know, I've seen developing over 20 years at this point, and it's just developed into such a robust and beautiful and powerful and moving way of expressing intellect and politics and care. And it's just, I'm just so happy to see this book in the world. When I was reading the prompt that Nicole gave us, I noticed that it said, it's so rich in theory and yet, you know, filled with affect. And I just thought, well, you know, there's no and yet there, you know, it's, you know, it's like the idea of theory and affect going together, to me feels, it's like, it's a no-brainer, you know, like, of course, you know, it's like passions drive your thinking. And I took a note when you were speaking, Joseph, about I think you said thought is always embodied. You know, it's like there is always a location and a situatedness to all of our cognition and intellection, and you know, and so something that breaks apart the way that, you know, that Cartesian split between mind and body and resutures them, I think is always a really important thing to do. And that structures of feeling are always where our thinking transpires. And when we say that something is unthinkable, I think it's because we don't have the structure of feeling that allows for the thought to happen. And so, you know, I just deeply appreciated the way that you address those issues in this book. As I was trying to like to think of a more concise way of saying, like, what is it that I think you're doing methodologically, you know, in this book? And the word that I eventually settled on was that you're practicing a poetics, you know, and like to think about poetics as like the art and science, like a techniques of bringing together thought and passion, you know, like that's like a, you know, Wikipedia level definition of poetics, you know, an art and science of bringing together thought and passion and expression. And that is just what you do so, so beautifully. That you, I think, not just develop a new critical vocabulary as you were outlining, but that, you know, you're developing a different poetics of expressing. Well, a thought here. I was speaking with a friend and colleague the other day who said, you know, what I'm really wanting to do in my work is to have zero distance between my thought and my ultimate beliefs. You know, that I don't want to put any distance between those things. And what this person was talking about specifically was some of their cosmological and religious beliefs, and how you express a sense of what your you know, ontoepistemic cosmology is in your academic work, particularly when we have a secular religious, you know, divide in our thinking. And this colleague was saying, I just want to blow that up and express what I think is actually true in the deepest, most possible sense through how I do my academic work. And I see you doing that so beautifully. How does this relate to some of my own work? You know, I feel like I've made whatever reputation I have doing transgender studies, you know, whatever that is, because I think it's not just the study of people who have a transgender identity, but that it is a way of thinking about how embodied, gendered, classified identities, socialities are articulated, how they change over time, how you can sort of move between them. And that, for me, in my own intellectual development, I really think it was the work that I was doing with the Somatechnics research network that sort of came together at Macquarie that really helped me think beyond the specificities of talking about transgender people to think about these sort of broader processes of categorizations of life and how you move across them and transcend them. And so I increasingly think about trans with a hyphen or trans with an asterisk as, not necessarily connected to gender, thinking about transgender as a poetics, again, of moving across biological classifications of life that are not reducible to the sex gender concept. Increasingly, I think about transness as a poetic or aesthetic mode for producing a new semiosis of what embodiment means, and that in that sense, I want to put it on the sort of in the same category of transing gender, put it in the same category as a kind of, racial freedom struggle. It's like it's an enacted belief that the body can come to mean otherwise than it has. It's like the old feminist adage of, biology is not destiny. It's a way of acknowledging that we are biological creatures, but that what our biology does and how it is a basis for relating to others and the world is something that is not given in advance, and that there's an ethical demand, there are an ethical components to live life in a way that also accommodates other life. So I would say that is how my work is informed by the work that you do, is that you just help me see those things much more clearly. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Randa, would you like to speak to the question a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm speaking to you all from Darug country, and yesterday I was at the local park with my children who play soccer there, and it's actually close to an old mission where Aboriginal children were stolen from their families and sent to this mission. The mission itself has since been removed, and a park where my children play soccer has been superimposed on this site. And every time we drive through that park, the street sign is named after the owners of that mission. And I was thinking about your book, Joseph, and how every time I'm at that park, there's a sense of this haunting. And you have this beautiful line in your book about, citations of layered histories of violence. And I just think that for me, the most powerful thing that I've taken away from your book is the forensic ecology, the idea that there's trace evidence of violence all around us, and how the settler state, the colonial state, constantly tries to erase it, constantly tries to dismiss its relevance or importance or its power, and yet its haunting continues, its visceral impact on us, it's an affective impact. I mean, I effectively feel I'm in a space of a violent past, and that itself means that it's a violent present, that it's not something that you can relegate to the distant past. It's something that still permeates the way that we interact with that space. And I think with your opening chapter in particular, I came to your book as a former lawyer, as an academic, but mainly, and as a writer. And as a writer, I live in the everyday, in the interspaces of the interpersonal, writing a book on Palestine for children. I was messaging people on Facebook, asking them, what color are the flowers on this road? That's what I pay attention to. But I read your book first and foremost as the daughter of a dispossessed Palestinian. And so the first chapter for me, wow, like I had to pause at so many junctures in it, because it had such an affective impact on me. In particular, your framework of forensic ecology. And Susan, I really liked and appreciated what you said about the theory and yet, because for me, I was relieved to have a theoretical framework in which to finally understand what I was going through when I first went and saw my father's land and my father's house, which he is not allowed to return to as a Palestinian. And the only reason that we could return was because of our Australian passports. And I remember vividly, not only in his accounts to me of what he heard from people at the time of the Nakba, but also in accounts of the Nakba, how Palestinians would have food that was still cooking in their kitchens, tables that were set, toys on the floor, and they fled. And that for me would, you know, that's traces of the evidence of the Nakba. That's those remnants of what's happened are just as important and need to be recognized. When we returned to my father's house in the year 2000, the house had been completely ransacked by Israeli soldiers who were, my father is from a village called Burka in the city of Nablus, and it's actually well known to be a village that produces a lot of resistance fighters, which I'm very happy about. It explains a lot about my own sort of passion, I hope. But the house had been completely ransacked. They had basically ran through it, and everything was, the furniture had been turned upside down. The one thing that still haunts me was the wedding dress. A great aunt's wedding dress had been trampled on the floor and then stomped on, and then bricks smashed on it and just left there. So when we arrived, that was the scene that greeted my father when we returned. And you have, you know, these beautiful lines in your book where you talk about, you know, about limbs and beams, lungs and windows, indexes of suffering, you know, pain and loss. And that theoretical framework just really hit me very hard. And I just want to show, you know, some photos. I hope it can be seen of, you know, that we were walking through and looking at these, you know, just the rubble, the trees. And for me, that's a crime scene. You know, that was something that when we went back to my family in Jordan, who were all there as refugees, that's my father, next to one of his, in the backyard, you know, they said, why would you take photos of the house like that? And I said, because that, we have to honor what's happened. We have to account for it. And that in itself is our history. And so for me, that's just what, it's so powerful, the way that you provided that theoretical lens of, you know, that severed relationship of my father as the child of that home, and that severance between him and his house. But the house itself has its own story, its own testimony. It is a witness to what happened. So for me, that was one of the most powerful, effective and intellectual things that I took away from your book.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yes, so it's nice to meet you, Joseph. And I'm going to sort of, I think, share as both as a panelist, but also as one of the people that selected this book. And I have to tell you, I've read a lot of books. I've been on this in this particular organization for several years, and I've read a lot of really well-intentioned books. And typically when I read, I saw this book and I thought, oh no, this is well-intentioned. We're in trouble here. And as I started to read it, I get very skeptical, because that's actually my tendency as a scholar is to want to be well-intentioned, and then my writing falls apart. It has to come from I think a deeper place. And thank you for sharing your, you know, the impetus for this. And it was right around page 22 that I thought, okay, here's where it's either going to like fall off a cliff or it's going to be great, right? And when you mentioned on page 23, Chief Justice Robert Yazzie, I thought, oh no, that's where I grew up. He's going to get this wrong. And you didn't. And I thought, oh, good. You know, he's talking about my backyard. So I grew up on the joint Navajo Hopi reservation. Most of my friends were Diné or Hopi. And the way you started to write about it, you'd already set up a framework. I agree with the other panelists that this ecological forensics was perfect. Like talking about ecology, that's a metaphor I've used in a lot of my scholarship, and I do technical writing. I'm not always counter to technology, but I'm typically very, very skeptical about it because it is, you know, imbricated in our sociopolitical scene. So it is and I do user experience. And so I train people to see the damage they're doing before they do it. I'm in there trying to get them to understand just how powerful this is, and how most of what we're working on is a way of forgetting the violence that occurs. But at that moment, you started to, I think, knit things together and reflect a lot of the worldviews that you talk about it. And it's incredibly complicated to do that. That's, I think, why I was so skeptical. Just on the Navajo reservation, there are over 200 political groups. When you introduce yourself in Diné, I went to school to study Diné poetry. That was my PhD until the very last second. And then obviously I had a moment of like, wait, I can't do this. I can't take a job that someone else could do much better and connect with the community. So I switched to technical writing. But it is a very complicated way of looking at the world relationally. Is there's a commitment to it that you have to do. And this book was showing that, not just in the theory, which is very well done, and that's my connection to it with posthumanism. But it's complicated to even use a word like that, because people think, oh, transhumanism, we are embracing the not human. Like, no, it's complicated. It's the more than human. We have to look at inhumanity. We have to look at what has humanism done? What has it made us forget? How are all of these Eurocentric roots sort of plugging into humanism in a way that directs us away from that relationality? And this book carefully brings that together. It gives us the stakes, visceral stakes, emotional stakes, community stakes, and every scene that you were upon, you showed us both in the writing. The photography was jarring, but also true to what I experienced growing up in a very colonized place, and in a place that makes me forget my own colonization. I have roots in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and I have a father-in-law who recently passed, but would have been surprised about the mourning of the Queen. I've had uncles tortured to death, and your book doesn't flinch from that, and it also takes care to not just be a tourist in it, right? So to unfold the stakes, and I do think that the stakes that you're describing about our survival on the planet are the ones that we're all really working from. I think if we're reflective of that, most of us are pretty worried about it, and that we're going to have to find ways to take more care. And I think that we do have, you said from time immemorial, that's true, but at least we know at least tens of thousands of years of wisdom and experience that we can avail ourselves of if we can connect our thoughts to it and we can listen and hear it. And you do that beautifully in this book, in many, many places. And so as it was the case every year I've been involved with this award, it became obvious as I read which book was the best book, because of its urgency and because of what it was doing, not because it was the cleverest, although it was very, very clever, not because it was the most beautifully written, although it was beautifully written, but because it all came together to do something important. And I didn't agree with all of it. There are moments where I think, well, I think I disagree, but that's fine. And I was taking things from it to say, how can I challenge my work to test what I'm doing, and to sound it, to see if what comes back is that same knitting together, that same, am I bringing that same urgency to it? And the answer is often no. So this book, and I guess I'm going to leave with a question here, because I'm involved tangentially with a search. We have a new school of forensics, and I want to hear your advice, maybe not right away, but how an institution that prides itself on innovation, but that sometimes we move so quickly past that interrogation, and then past interrogation to actually connection and relationality. How can we be more thoughtful about the way that we think about forensics in this history, so that we are bringing in those perspectives that maybe arc us closer to being more responsible with the way that we conduct our business at Arizona State and in the world.
Joseph, feel free to jump in if you want.
Right. Well, look, I mean, I actually think that that's a really important question, Andrew. And I guess my concern with forensics is that it has disavowed its deep colonial and racial histories. And prior to the writing of this book, I had done work on forensic pathology, what they call typical body charts. And it was a deep investigation into the way in which forensic labs in the US, Australia, and the UK use what they call typical body charts to go out into the field and to document signs of trauma on, say, on the body of the victim, where there's been a laceration. They will mark it on the drawing of the body. And when I looked at these multiracial, multi-ethnic nations, all of the typical body charts were white. They were, Caucasian. And then I sort of began to investigate it further and found actually that, anatomical atlases, forensic illustrations and iconography were actually deeply embedded within colonial practices of grave robbery of African-American graves, of Indigenous graves here in Australia, the settler colonial state of Australia, and that those bodies of colour actually supplied the epistemological knowledges of forensics, but they were completely effaced from the textbooks, except for, their ontological resource power to provide, the material substance that was then transmuted into Western knowledge. So I'm very ambivalent about forensics, even as I draw upon it. And so when I went into the forensic ecologies frame, I actually went into the discipline of forensic ecologies, which is a sub-discipline of the larger forensics. And I was surprised when I went into forensic ecologies, because I expected that some account of the more than human unto itself as worthy of consideration would be there, and it wasn't. It was completely absent. Forensic ecologies, as a legitimate subfield of forensics, only deals with sort of entomology, plant life, soil, as it will shed light on the human, full stop. So there's no sense that we could transpose this to a crime scene where, a forest has been bombed or cleared or whatever it else is. So I think there's a lot of work there to begin to visibilize those colonial and racial and anthropocentric genealogies, because forensics is important precisely because it gives testimony and voice and accountability to victims of crime and to survivors of crime. So I don't want to throw it out, because I think it's got a crucial role. But I think those histories have to be accounted for. They have to be materialized, and they have to reshape the discipline. Just to give you a sense of how I view the field.
So part of course, being someone trained in the humanities, our arguments in this search have been largely like etymological, right? So looking at forensics having a similar root to even forest, right? So forum and fora and having to do with out of doors, and eventually actually comes from the Sanskrit for door, and this idea that people would gather in these outdoor places to hold public sort of gatherings to figure out what happened, right? And it's just funny how that gets effaced in service of the human, but really of the juridical sort of and power that's been sort of affixed to the human figure and to the racialized, gendered, Western human figure. And sort of unpacking that seems like such a heavy lift, right? I mean, I think it takes you a lot of notes, a lot of hundreds of pages and a lot of notes to kind of to detach from the defense of this particular power structure, right? To the point of like obvious violence and obvious trauma that we sort of pretend that it's not there, to hold on to this sort of sense of, oh, well, everything's fine, everything's great. There is no military, bombs aren't happening, drones, whatever. What was your process for unpacking that yourself? I mean, I think that it's tempting to reside in that comfort. It becomes quite difficult to not feel traumatized just thinking about it all the time. How do you sort of bring yourself to it and connect to the, is it overwhelming, or how do you?
Look, thank you for that question, Andrew, because it brings up two things. One, and I'm not sure if readers sense this when they're reading the book, because I was so rigorously pushing back against the anthropocentric frame primarily, I often felt that I was pushing to the limits of intelligibility in terms of my writing, because so much of what I wanted to say does not make sense in the anthropocentric frame. It just doesn't. And I think there was a moment where I was aware of that, and it was a what the heck moment. Let me go ahead with it anyway. And I think that comes from the fact that I come from a non-English speaking background. There's a racialized history about my relationship to English, and a history of displacement and not being a legitimate writer and speaker and thinker in English. And that's an institutionalized, racialized history that I lived. But that's given me the freedom to be an outsider to the language and to take liberties with it that I feel, you know, so the word's not there, let me invent it. And I felt, and, you know, but the commitment that comes then is if you invent the word, justify it and try and make it intelligible, because I had a sense, like, you know, when I try to account for the torture of animals and the way in which there isn't a word to describe the torture of animals, I thought, well, inanimal, you know, it doesn't exist. Let's invent it. But it sort of wavers in what I call an epistemic void, because there's no infrastructure for that, you know, that lexical neologism to take root or to be self-evidently intelligible. So the difficulty with the book was to push against that anthropocentric dogma, that constrictive frame of what is deemed to be intelligible, and to try and think otherwise and to write otherwise, so as to bring into focus what it negates effectively. And that was difficult. That was really difficult. I don't know I succeeded, but I really tried hard to do that.
And Susan, that puts me in mind with your notion of trans with the dash, right? So it's the same thing. So we're using neologisms in the same way that Derrida did, right? In some sense, yeah.
Right.
Can I just jump in before Susan does and say, you know, there was such a reciprocity when Susan and I began to work together, because I found her notion of trans so important in thinking through issues of relationality between disparate subjects that would seem disconnected or not legitimately connected within terms of, you know, hegemonic frames. And, you know, I think the power and the beauty of what Susan does is, again, she mobilizes an incredibly intense poetics to materialize the power of trans, but also she, and she marked this, she transposes it above and beyond the trans body to heterogeneous sites, subjects, and power relations. And I think what for me is so powerful about the term trans, as the asterisk, as Susan says, is that it encapsulates the possibility to move, the possibility to think otherwise, and the possibility to think relationalities that aren't seen to be legitimate or don't exist even. Thanks, Susan.
Sure, you're welcome. I mean, it's a mutual admiration society, like I said, because I feel like I was able to theoretically expand what I meant by trans by engaging with some of your work on biopolitics. And so maybe another question to jump into here, thinking about neologisms, is that, you know, the title of the book is Biopolitics of the More Than Human. But one of the questions I kept asking is like, well, is bio enough? You know, is that a big enough politics? Even when you're breaking it down into, you know, a zoopolitics or a phytopolitics. I mean, as you mentioned yourself, there's there's a politics of the relationship of the biotic to the abiotic, and why I think it's so necessary to move in the direction that you do in the book towards the cosmological is that, like, I think we have to have a frame of reference and a set of values that will let us engaged with the significance of the non-living, as in a biotic sense, as having a kind of vitality or an entity quality that the abiotic is also something that we are kin with, and that it's like I was taking notes what you were saying about feeling like sometimes you get to the limits of expressibility or intelligibility when you're really trying to unsettle the framework that is just so deeply say colonized into our subjectivities and embodiment. Like if your political goal is to try to reach beyond that, or to deconstruct that, or to be the worm that's boring from within that like gets to an outside somewhere. It's like it's just really hard. It's really hard to do, and so I thought the way that you worked with words in the book, it's like did a lot of that work. So I took a lot of notes on the ways that you were doing what it was that you were doing. But back to the question, it's like, do you think if you were going to come up with a word that was bigger than biopolitics, for the more than human, it's like, what would that word be?
I don't know, but I absolutely agree. And bios doesn't even begin to encompass the heterogeneity of entities that we need to attend to ethically. And so, and you know what it's like. I mean, it is a step process, and it is a question of trying to navigate that fine line between intelligibility and unintelligibility. And there's a responsibility to the readers to not to overstep that line too much, so that the framework begins to be unintelligible, so to speak. So I thought that the biopolitics, it's problematic. I couldn't agree more. It doesn't capture everything that it needs to capture, but it also is an incredibly relevant regime to begin to understand the way things are being governed, destroyed, impacted upon within the contemporary context. I don't have the word. I'm looking for someone to develop the word that's going to replace the bios of politics. So, yeah.
Well, it looks like we should have a brainstorming session then.
Right.
Just like we did with Soma Techniques.
Exactly.
Right,
and I remember that time at Soma Techniques, right? And we were all in this room and we were all brainstorming. It was really fun, actually. So, yeah. Look, I want to jump into a different question. Joseph, you underscore that processes of decolonization need to be simultaneously underpinned by questions of ecological and environmental justice. So I'm going to ask the panel again, and feel free to just jump in rather than me just go around the room kind of thing. But what is the relation between decolonization and ecological justice, and why do we need to think them together? So is there anything the panel would like to say to answer that question or to think through that question?
I can start.
Excellent.
Well,
Thanks, Randa.
I was thinking about it. I've just got so many notes on so many things, but I was thinking about it in terms of the olive tree for Palestinians, and Joseph, you talk about in the book the ceremonies for olive trees which are uprooted and destroyed, and how the practices of resistance that Palestinians employ in relation to those olive trees as a testament to their relationship with the land, and as a testament also to, for example, Palestinians in the diaspora. My father and other Palestinians ensuring that their backyards in suburban Sydney have an olive tree, that they have those fruit trees, and that in itself is a statement about who we are as Palestinians, that we are, back again, like to the unity intifada, that is Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestinians as refugees, those in 48 and in Gaza and in the West Bank, that all of us are connected by this relationship, this transcendent spiritual relationship with trees, and how, is the greenwashing that Israel engages in as it burns and destroys Palestinians' farmlands. I read a statistic that in 2020, Israeli soldiers and settlers burned and uprooted more than 8,400 trees, and that there's been between 2000 and 2006 1 million trees in Gaza. That also speaks to the issue of food sovereignty and the way that Israel controls Palestinians' forms of farming and subsistence, and the way that this in itself is applied as levers of apartheid and of settler colonialism, and what Palestinians are doing to reclaim farming practices, to be able to rely on themselves in the face of this occupation and apartheid machinery. And that kind of machinery, in which, for example, picking za'atar, which every Palestinian home knows very well, is criminalized. It comes with a fine, it can't come with imprisonment. And how something as as everyday as just the picking of shrubs and herbs is a criminal act, under Israeli apartheid, and how being able to reclaim that is important as a process of decolonization, as a process of saying we will take sovereignty over the way that we have the way that we engage with our land, and the risks that comes with that as well. So I think that's absolutely critical. And of course, in the book you talk about the aquifers and the violence around water resources and the theft of water resources. And so often, one of the frustrating things when we look at the Western media coverage of what's happening in Palestine, it's always that things have blown up suddenly. It always starts with a bomb, or it always starts with a clash, as though all the violence in between doesn't count. And that is the violence that impacts on the everyday, that impacts not just on the bodies that are killed by missiles and airstrikes, but the water that is poisoned or stolen, the land and the farming that is burnt, the settlers who destroy Palestinian crops. And as you speak in the book, these are victims of crime. These are witnesses of the violence that is happening on a daily basis.
Well, thank you, Randa. And look, I also wanted to thank you for sharing your father's photographs and for sharing that haunting image, which is now deeply seared in my brain, of your aunt's wedding dress trampled and shredded underfoot. And as you so eloquently said, it was speaking his own testimony when you were witness to that desecration, so to speak. And thank you too for bringing into focus the multiple dimensions of the occupation that get effaced from the Western media. And I think that's what really sort of haunts me too, and that is the erasure of the enormity of what happens on a day-to-day basis. What Rob Nixon calls, and I cite in the book, the slow violence, the violence really that goes under the radar. The seepage of the toxins from spent ordnance in soil, the floating into the atmosphere of all the micro particulates that follow the bombing of concrete structures, and that then get inhaled into lungs and become carcinogenic. They're not seen, they're not reported by the media, but they are instantiations of slow violence on that microcellular level that fan out from those ecologies of destruction and continue, if you like, that process of settler elimination within Palestine. So really, that sense of the exigency of ecology is that it captures the water, the soil, the air. And what I also try to do, and Nicole, this would resonate for you. I invoke the concept, the Derridean concept of autoimmunity, where you do something destructively enough to the other, it will boomerang back upon you And, you know, that's where I developed that notion of transboundary politics of autoimmunity, because what is happening is that the destruction that's been wreaked by the Israeli state in Palestine cannot be contained in Palestine. It cannot be contained by the fence, the borders, and the wall, because it seeps across into Israel. It seeps into the oceans with the sewage plants that are bombed by the Israeli strikes, killing, you know, life in the Mediterranean. So something larger is at stake here in terms of that relational framework. And, you know, one way I tried to capture that larger relational framework was to draw on Merleau-Ponty's really hauntingly beautiful phrase, the flesh of the world. Because if we begin to look at the water, the soil, the plants, the trees, as the flesh of the world, well, then we become ethically cognizant that we just can't kill or torture or maim or destroy them with impunity, because they are actually coextensive with our own flesh in the end.
Can I just jump in also to say that when we're talking about this process of decolonization, and in particular Palestine, so, you know, you speak in the book about Gaza as the weapon testing laboratory, and Palestinians and the infrastructure of Israeli occupation, where weapons are field tested in real time and then exported in service of the war on terror, in service of the global war on terror, and how so often in this resistance movement of Palestinians, there's a failure to understand that it plugs into a global resistance against a larger force here, because what's happening in Palestine against Palestinians is not isolated from what's happening in Guantanamo Bay, from what's happening in Ferguson in Missouri, and the IDF training police officers in America, and the fight for, you know, for a decolonized world is something that is part of a transnational resistance movement. And you draw that out beautifully in the book, that these aren't just isolated, you know, weapons labs. They plug into the way colonized people have always been experimented on and their bodies brutalized in service of colonialism. And you know, that for me was a really important point. Again, also, you know, you had some of the most powerful parts of the book were when you're talking about the animal and human divide, and this idea of the Palestinian as the non-human animal who, you know, is brutalized. And there was you know, a part of the book where you talk about the meme of the Palestinian who was burned alive, and his face, you know, a pig's face superimposed. And you referred to how, you know, Palestinians are considered, you know, non-human or pre-criminal, you know, going back to resonating with Lombroso's anthropology. And that had resonances for me with the sort of countering violent extremism, you know, forensic, you know, pursuit of the pre-criminal Muslim, the pre-criminal racialized other, that you can, you know, you can meticulously understand that these people need to be civilized, that they're barbaric. For me, all of this points to the fact that as a Palestinian reading this book, it's not just about Palestine, you know, that this is, like you said, something more urgent and global. And that's where I think the power of the book lies, in giving us testimonies that we can use in that global resistance against violence and this like dehumanizing, destructive global order.
Thank you. Yes.
Does anyone else want to comment on any of this? Or
Yeah, well, so I wanted to sort of build on this and to sort of make a sort of different line of inquiry here. So we have a lot of these decolonizing the curriculum moves that we make at lots of institutions, and they're typically pretty shallow, and it's most of these are sort of shibboleths where you speak these particular terms, and the people that you're assigning this to end up being overworked, typically women, typically faculty of color, typically contingent, typically, you know, not going to have much of an effect. And one of the things that and I've been involved with this as being someone who's in none of these groups, but something that makes me very angry is that the conversation never starts with the fact that we actually still have colonies, that these exist. Palestine is a colonized space. Northern Ireland is a colonized space. There are many places that are still colonized, and so the stakes are high, and as such, then it's not going to be putting 5 things on a to-do list and then checking them off and then having this ceremony, before Christmas, and then everybody goes home and feels good about themselves. One of the things that I think pairs well with this book in my mind. So what you've done is you sort of uncovered this way of looking at the world of accounting for what has not been accounted for, of perception, understanding, coming to our senses, our affect, our embodied experience, but memory practices that end up being life practices that a lot of Indigenous communities have had to do. Visitors' term survivance. He took this as a Anishinaabe journalist, that he told stories for these networks, these information networks that were very much effacing of the cultures that he participated in. But then he would turn, using a lot of neologisms. If you read his fiction, he's just incredible at redirecting the Western mind, at thinking about how do we remember things, every morning, every day, every evening, through the cycles. When you introduce yourself, who are you? Where are you situated? In Dene, it's you always introduce your mothers. I was born for this tribe, my mother's tribe. Born for my father's mother's tribe. It's matrilineal, and then pretty soon you see these where you're situated. But I guess the question I have when we're doing these decolonization activities, or when we're trying to change things, is how do we change how we are networked together in the larger, more reciprocal sense, and how do we practice that every day in a way that is mindful of all of these different entities that we don't acknowledge on a day-to-day basis, both biological but also non-biological, also cosmological, also ideological, and inviting the relationality with these folks. How do we do that? How do we do that as academics, but also as human beings, that in a way that does start to decolonize us in our daily practice?
Is that a question for the panel? Or for
Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm struggling with. I have my own ways, but you don't need to hear. I'm just curious.
Go ahead.
No, Susan, you go.
No, I mean, what was I going to say? So thinking about the relationship between the ecological and the decolonial, that was the question that was your prompt. And for me, I mean, just to speak very broadly, it's like, it just seems so clear that the ecological is, as everybody's been saying today, is in a state of crisis, and it simply things can't go on the way, things will not go on the way they have been going on. And the question is, like, how will they go on from here? And that, it also seems very clear when you look historically that, the emergence of Eurocentric modernity over the last 500 or 600 years is like deeply implicated in the ecological crisis. And so if we take that viewpoint of like, well, the ecological is what I am enmeshed in, and without the world, there is no me to be in it and of it. And so there's just this direct link between decolonial practice and ecological sustainability. Then the only, I mean, that seems kind of intuitively obvious to me, but like that thinking then about how do you like engage in the work of decoloniality? And it's such a big question. It's like it's a reworlding of, you know, everything that we know. It's like there isn't one place to begin. So just in terms of my own method, you know, I do try to listen. You know, like I think you know, I've written some about what I call the strange bedfellows of, like, if we are all within this Eurocentric world order, it's like that we need to bring together the strange bedfellows of the pre-modern, the non-Western, the indigenous, the futural, and the speculative or imaginative. It's like that these are the places to go to try to think an outside to the world order that we are currently in. And that you know, I try to listen to those outsides as best as I can access them. But then, you know, there's also if we take seriously the idea that our very structures of feeling, our concepts, our ideas, I mean, everything is like, it is structured in a particular way that it helps keep this world system in place. That part of the decolonial practice is not just, you know, resisting or witnessing the sort of macro political structurations of coloniality, but also like doing the subjective work, you know, the personal work of trying to like uproot those structures of feelings and forms of knowing from oneself, you know, partly by listening to things outside the frame of reference that is given to us, you know, but also by, I think by, you know, by actively, I mean, doing, you know, a lot of, I don't even know what to call it, like, you know, woo-woo, you know, interpersonal work of just like, of learning how to relate effectively differently than we have. I've been coming out a lot in recent years to talk about the fact that I have a psychedelic practice, and I do think of the mindful use of psychedelics can be a way of making more aware to your senses that we live in this like sensate world that we often like, you know, filter out through our, you know, habituated, sedimented ways of thinking and knowing. And that kind of, you know, that kind of relationship to a chemical teacher, you know, can be as powerful as like, you know, reading non-Western literature or listening to, you know, indigenous creation stories or you know, reading science fiction literature that like experiments with you know, thinking about what a better social order would be. So, you know, I think of all of those kinds of practices as being embedded within this large problematic that you just outlined. It's like we will either die or live in a transformed world, you know, and that the practice of decoloniality in every register is vital to that potential future. So, you know, what else is there to do? You know, I don't know. I can't think of anything else to do.
But from my point of view, it's something that like it really grips me. What happens when Palestine is free? Who will we be? And we're so constantly in a state of resistance and fighting and defense and decolonialism that the space to think about who we want to be, what the potential, you know, what's on the other side, how much have we lost of ourselves? And, you know, when you talk about, you know, cosmo epistemologies and indigenous frameworks, I see within my own Muslim and, you know, Palestinian communities a distancing and a loss of who we are and of those practices many times because of the violence. You know, something as you know, as simple as the rights of animals, and you write about this extensively, and how there's this tension, for example, in Gaza between those who insist on trying to maintain a zoo for the children and who insist on looking after the animals, and then those who say we can't feed ourselves, we can't, as you know, as humans, we don't have enough to eat. You know, why are you prioritizing the animals? That for me represents an alienation from those epistemologies in which the animal and the human have rights, and especially in the Islamic paradigm, which I feel has been completely lost because of the broader structures of violence. And so I think it's so important that we provide space to think about who we're going to be once we are freed, because you don't want to get there and suddenly realize we're reproducing the same violence that we were resisting for so long. And there's always a risk and danger of that. We've internalized those structures and then we just end up reproducing them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, you know, the indissociable relation between colonialism and ecocide is not something that I invented. It's something that has been attested to across a vast body of Indigenous writing, because the project of the settler state, the project of colonialism, the project of empire has entailed practices of systemic ecological destruction in order to ensure those practices of elimination and replacement by the colonizers. And they've been documenting this for centuries. And you know, Indigenous people have also said, how can you possibly talk about decolonization if there's no land left upon which to stand, because it's been ecologically decimated, it's been ecologically destroyed. So it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into any coherent framework. So that's, you know, where I stand, and that's the legacy I think that's been gifted to us by Indigenous experience and histories. I think, Andrew, you know, it's a really difficult question to answer in, if you like, a formulaic way, because I think there's a sense that we have to move contingently in order to respect the ground upon which we stand and the relationships that are already there, even prior to us. And I think, Susan, you mark the importance of listening to what surrounds us and the knowledges and feelings of structure that are already extant. And Randa, you paid respect to that in the park that you walk through, in which there's already a prior history that's been erased, but it cannot be erased because everything there is saturated with that racialized colonial violence that cannot be expunged. It's not just a park, it's also a site of trauma and destruction, and it still speaks to that. So I think those contingent relations have to be taken into account. They have to be focused on, but also, you know, as Andrew says, then they have to be connected, and as Susan and Randa, to transnational frameworks, so that it becomes a collective working through. So I don't think there can be sort of formulaic universalizing assertions. They have to be embedded within the contingency of where we are, take account of the knowledges and the relationships of where we are, and then carefully and respectfully, ethically connect them to the larger state and transnational formations to try and achieve, you know, decolonization and decolonization across all that broad, more than human spectrum.
Well, on that beautiful summary, we have 10 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to questions. There's a few questions, and one of them, the first one, Joseph, for you is, did you experience any barriers to publishing your work? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I did. There were demands from another publisher to self-censor on Palestine. And the upshot of that was that I walked away from that contract. It was a difficult journey, and it took a number of years. But I do want to acknowledge the sustained support of people like Susan, who were on that journey with me and were incredibly enabling. And I'll preempt myself and acknowledge Courtney Berger, Jasby Pawar, and Mel Chen at Duke University Press. for their belief in the book and for their support and guidance in enabling the book to see the light of day. What I experienced was insignificant in comparison to the ongoing censorship of speaking truth to power in the context of Palestine, particularly from Palestinian activists, academics, and writers. And I want to acknowledge that it's a struggle on a daily basis that I know Palestinian people have to fight.
There's another question, says from Kevin McHugh at ASU, and he says, beyond biopolitics, raised by Susan Stryker, looking for direction in thought and language, I think of Elizabeth Povinelli's Geontologies. So that's just a statement there. So, and then there was another question. Oh, actually, something that it was not a question, something I thought about, and that was when Susan's talking about listening. And I think for me the question, I linked it to Joseph's book, and it was and listening is so important. The question is, how do we listen? You know, and sometimes we don't want to listen. So. And Joseph, in your book, something that moved me so much, and which I've actually since quoted in some of the work that I've written, is the way in which some of the detainees were actually listening to the animals around them. And it was the animals that, in some ways, using Donna Haraway's term, they were forced to be attuned to the other, because they were in situations of extreme violence that enabled them to listen, maybe ways that they may not have been at other times. And they listened to the ants, and they listened to the birds, and those creatures brought hope and a form of survival, like both psychologically, mental, as well as physical survival. That was just a kind of comment for me. It was just thinking about what Susan was saying, and yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. And for me, it comes from lived experience. In my backyard, I have a very deep and effective relationship with the birds. And I listen to what they say. There are the ravens, the lorikeets, the crested pigeons, and the magpies. And, you know, as they acknowledge you for who you are, but there's also a clear sense of where trust lies and how it needs to be maintained, to the point where they agentically determine the structure of the relationship. And that's where you need to sort of, if you like, give up your sense of anthropocentric knowingness and privilege and step back and listen to what they have to say. And the rewards of that are just inestimable. I cannot.
I believe you.
Yeah.
So Joseph, that's part of my morning practice. Is we go out and we speak with the birds. And you're right. I mean, when we had mentioned time changes, especially when we're going across places. When I was in Kenya, the birds would wake me up at 3:30 in the morning, because that's when they stir, which is great if you have a meeting, but it's annoying if it's not. But then after a while, you realize that if you want a relationship with those birds, there's a certain commitment and de-egoification. You have to sort of annihilate that a bit, because they're in charge of more than you think, and you have ways of changing your world in good and bad ways, and you have to be open.
I have something from Kusar Ali, a statement which I'm going to read out, and then Joseph, I'm going to leave it to you to end the session. Okay. So Corsa says, I'm a PhD candidate at Macquarie University, supervised by Joseph, who I'm eternally thankful to be mentioned by. He reminds me of the importance of both learning and unlearning. Something that has not been mentioned is how passionate Joseph is about teaching, and he encouraged me to begin teaching at university. Joseph, can you speak to the importance of teaching and how it is a tool for the social justice themes that you care about in the book? Congratulations on the award, so well deserved.
Thank you, Corsa. Yes, look, I'm a passionate teacher because I think that's the way to transform the world, but not a teacher who dogmatically dictates what needs to be done or what needs to be said, but one who provokes processes of unthinking, so that we begin speaking from a Eurocentric position. We begin to unlearn the dogmas that have been so damaging to our own psyches, but also to the world at large. So, you know, when we're looking for what, you know, the great Marxian question, what can we do? What needs to be done? I think learning and teaching is absolutely crucial in that. And the legacies of that, again, are inestimable, because good teaching permeates communities. It permeates larger spheres and changes things in really productive ways. You know, on that note, yes, yes to learning and teaching and unlearning the dead weight of the dogmas that we've imbibed.
First, I want to thank the panel for being part of this discussion. I really appreciate your time. And thank you to all the participants who are here today. This discussion and Joseph's talk will be up on YouTube, so you can go back and listen to it if you need to. And I'm just going to hand over to Joseph, and I'll say goodbye to everybody.
Okay.
Joseph.
Well, yeah, thank you. What I'd like to do just in closing is to give my gratitude and thanks to a number of people who have made all of this possible. I want to thank Professor Nicole Anderson as the director of the IHR Institute for her commitment, for her passion, and for her support. Ron Broglio, the IHR Advisory Board and Humanities Research Institute, the University of Arizona, for awarding the book this very distinguished prize. My profound thanks to Randall Abdelphata, Jacob Leviton, Ilana Luna, Andrew Mara, and Susan Stryker, of course, for so generously contributing to this event. And I acknowledged Susan as being absolutely crucial on my journey to enabling this book to see the light of day. My thanks to Duke University Press and Ken Wissaker, and particularly grateful to Jasbir Puar and Mel Chen for their belief in the book, Courtney Berger for her care and support and constructive guidance, to the anonymous referees, and also to Derek Gregory and Claire Colebook, who also supported this book. I want to thank Iqbal Bakat, Ronman Carlson, Maria Jonakopoulos, Rima Hamami, Marilena Palati, Holly Randall Moon, Nadira Shalub Kevorkian, and Adrian Simpson, Tess Alice for their support. And then there are no words, as I say in the book, with which I can express my thanks to Sivendrini Pereira. As I say, no inventory can do justice to the way she's been there. I'm also incredibly grateful to the late and great Uncle Ray Jackson, the president of the Indigenous Social Justice Association, who for me has been an irreplaceable friend and mentor, who illuminated me on this ongoing journey in terms of Indigenous knowledges and ethics. And my heartfelt thanks to my sister, Rafaela, and my late brother-in-law, Larry, for their profound commitment and unwavering support. And my heartfelt thanks to Trish and Sebastian for all their support and love on this, what's been a difficult journey for me. And finally, thanks to all my non-human collaborators that are inscribed in the book, the birds, the trees, and all the others who've inspired and taught me how to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And your prize is in the mail.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.